Major Russ Cooper, formerly of the Canadian Air Force. Could you tell us a little bit about your own background before we launch into today's subject?
Oh, okay. I guess started off a flying career in the Canadian Air Force. Flew basically predominantly fighters. I flew CF-104s and starfighters and CF-18s. A little bit of combat experience in the first Persian Gulf War as deputy commander of the squadron that participated in the combat. Retired from the military after 27 years, went into commercial flying. Wound up, flew for Air Canada, did worldwide operations Air Canada, also did some security work for them on the heels of 9/11. You can understand Air Canada was quite concerned at the time with the terrorist threat that they suddenly found themselves within. Subsequent to that, retired from Air Canada in 2011. Went into private business as a engineering test pilot. Operated as a Transport Canada flight test delegate, responsible for certifying avionics systems on aircraft. And then moved into what I'm basically retired from those engineering duties, and now I've moved into civil rights issues, and was part of a small group that formed Canadian Citizens for Charter Rights and Freedoms, C3RF.
And yeah, I know that in the past you have looked at the diminishing freedom of speech that the Trudeau government has ushered in, but today we're here to talk about an extraordinary event. I mean, really unusual even by liberal government standards, or even by Trudeau standards. A piece of fiat, I'm not going to call it legislation, it was more like just a fiat edict, where I think over 15 different types of guns were suddenly made illegal with no act of parliament. There's no legislative process. It was just a declaration. And it's difficult for me to even wrap my head around it because it is so, I guess I'm going to say illegal, but I'm going to leave it to you to explain it better, if you would. Thank you.
Okay, well, I agree with you totally, Vlad. It's a real sleight of hand what they've done here. They've taken the Order in Council mechanism and used it to, as you say, declare a fiat with regards to the designation of, I think it's over 1,500 weapons. They've moved them basically from a restricted classification into a prohibited classification, which means that no one can own them in Canada unless you have special privileges or rights. You're in the military, police, or whatever. And it is a fiat because the purpose of an Order in Council really is to effect regulatory additions or changes or modifications to current acts of Parliament. The act that is in play here is a Firearms Act, Canadian Firearms Act of 1995. And what they've done is they've basically, rather than make regulatory changes, what they've done is they've changed the intent of the act, which is supposed to be something that Parliament does through the cut and thrust of debate by virtue of our elected representatives. So there has been no debate. We've had no representation in this matter. They've changed the intent of an act, basically. And the act basically sees prohibited weaponry as weaponry that is automatic in nature. That means one trigger pull, you get a burst of multiple rounds instead of just one round coming out the spout. So they've taken that definition and trashed it, and arbitrarily stated that these other weapons, which are what they call semi-automatic, one trigger pull, one bullet released, they've taken those weapons and designated them arbitrarily as prohibited. So it is a fiat. My interest is from a charter rights perspective, and the way I see this is it is a direct attack on our charter rights. We have our charter right number in Section 3. We have a voting right. That Section 3 voting right means that we have, as citizens, the right to elect representatives to represent us in Parliament, in the House of Commons, in the legislature. That right has been abrogated by virtue of the fact that they've come up with this new law, basically, without our input, and they've abrogated our Section 3 voting rights, because if you can vote for somebody, that means that somebody is obliged to represent you, and that's not being done in this case. The other charter right that's being impinged is Section 7. Section 7 gives us the right to life, liberty, and security of the person. And by security of the person, that's interpreted as meaning that we have a right to due process. We can't be arbitrarily dealt with. We can't be thrown in jail without a court, without a jury, without a hearing. And here we've had another instance where they've basically attacked our personal property in the form of weapons that we might have and hold and maintain, and they're taking them away without any due process or any hearing. So I see this as a charter rights issue, and I see more and more as we go down the road with this government, we are edging closer and closer to despotism, to tyranny, one-party rule. I think this is another example of us heading down that road.
Well, I guess if you were to add M103, and I think it's C16 or C17, the gender pronoun forced speech laws, it would be very, very difficult to argue with that. In any case,
well, that's right, Vlad. But we started this, C3RF started this back in 2017 with M103, Islamophobia. That motion basically entailed giving special privileges to one religion over another, and making it difficult to criticize our religion on the basis of its beliefs, its ideas, its doctrines, without being called an Islamophobe. We saw that as a slap in the face to freedom of speech. That's where we started. And since then, as you say, we've seen C16 come down the tubes that compels speech with respect to personal pronouns. If a person wants to be called a rock, a unicorn, or whatever, then you're obliged by law to comply in Canada and use the appropriate pronoun. It's moved on from there to we've had the summer jobs grants attestation initiative. Remember, you couldn't get grant money from the government for summer jobs if you didn't attest to certain values that the government thought were important. Values like abortion on demand, basically non-traditional values that many religious organizations couldn't sign up to, and therefore couldn't get the money. We've seen other initiatives, the digital charter, which came into being shortly after the Christchurch massacre, and with the election in 2019, it put severe penalties in place for social media platforms that don't comply with calling their sites for misinformation and disinformation, which, by the way, of course, is the definition of which is controlled by the government. So over and over again, almost on a weekly basis now, we're seeing initiatives that are coming out of this government that are setting us on the road to tyranny.
On behalf of Rare Foundation, thank you very much, Russ Cooper, for taking the time with us to explain this important and frightening turn of events in Canada.